Welcome back to Make Sylacauga Healthy Again. I'm your host, Dr. Jonathon Douglas of Broadway Spinal Care in Sylacauga. Today we're going to start our first in a series of what we're calling Going Down the Rabbit Hole. And we're going to start with just dipping our toe a little bit in this rabbit hole. Before we go any further, I want to make sure that everyone understands this, and this applies to all previous shows and all shows in the future, that anything we recommend or we talk about is just something to talk about. I want you to become informed. So just because we talk about it does not mean that it applies to you, and it does not mean that it's a medical recommendation of any kind. It's just information, and the best thing about information is that it's free, and it requires you to do some of the critical thinking that we talked about in previous shows. So I just want to make that really clear. We're going to be talking about some stuff that you can do to help yourself with your health, but that doesn't necessarily mean it applies to you. You need to talk to your healthcare practitioners and really understand how your health could be affected by doing all the things we're going to talk about. But in going down the rabbit hole, today is biohacking. And biohacking can start as simply as something like intermittent fasting and looking at your food and looking at your supplements. And it can go all the way down to spending $1 million a year or more on having your blood tested every day and having peptides and testosterone and potentially even inserting something into your brain. So biohacking today. We're going to talk about that. Stay tuned. Before we start talking about biohacking, we need to understand what that means. So the bio stands for biology, and really what we're talking about with biology in this sense is physiology, so how your body functions. And then hacking is very much like computer hacking. So we're going to take something in our body and we're going to try to change it so that it does something different. And the goal of biohacking is to try to make yourself not necessarily younger, but not age as quickly. So there used to be this concept of you want to live a long, long time, and I think that a lot of the people in the health world have realized that that's really a failed paradigm. You don't want to live a long, long time and have 20 years where you're just sitting in a chair and can't do anything. So it's much better to have a quality of life than a longevity of life. So how can we get our hormones and other blood values back to a normal baseline that, let's say, a 20-year-old has versus somebody like a 50-year-old like me? And so as a 50-year-old, I can tell you that I have started looking into this because the research is quite definitive that 50 years old is what they call the pivot point in aging. So you either become very serious about your health and you start trying to do something about it and looking into it, or things can drop off quite quickly and fall apart. So we have a little graphic on that I talk to patients about all the time. And which 50-year-old would you rather be? So we got a person with an expensive car, but it's been cheap on the health, and they have no health that's going to push them through the rest of their years and no quality of life, or high-functioning mitochondria, which means that you produce a lot of energy, you have a lot of energy, and you can still do a lot of the things you did in your 20s. This is a quote that I really like and I talk to people about, and it says, obesity is hard, and I would say that we could just substitute being healthy is hard, being fit is hard. You really do get to choose your hard in life, and that's a very important concept, and I think most people don't really understand that and maybe never hear it. But every part of life is hard. It's better to choose the disciplined hard, I promise you, than the regret kind of hard, but that's something everyone has to choose. But in biohacking, the critical point is 50. Now that doesn't mean if you're 40 years old and you think, wow, I really want to look into this and I want to find out how I can do things to help myself, that I shouldn't start. You should, because you gain a 10-year edge on that. And I'm not saying at 50 that I just started. We started down this rabbit hole in our early 20s actually, started exercising, supplementing, eating better foods, and there is a real benefit to that I can tell you, and I have seen patients completely transform themselves by doing very simple things. So I'm just going to throw out some concepts. We don't have time to talk about all of this. We're going to have shows talking about each of these subjects in the future. But if you want to really get started on biohacking, one thing you need to look into is intermittent fasting. And when you start reading about intermittent fasting, you will see quite quickly that when you fast, you start to break down the unhealthy cells in your body. And when you break down those unhealthy cells, then you keep yourself from becoming sick. So there are different formulas for it. There are different ways to do it. Some people cycle on and off. So it depends on what your lifestyle can accommodate. Even if you do it on a semi-regular basis, fasting can be an amazing thing, and it can certainly make someone younger. That goes into the calorie restriction side of things too. And so if you want to look into intermittent fasting, you also usually lead down to the calorie restriction side of it. And there's some debate as to whether that really is as helpful as what we used to think it was, but I think it's worth looking at because for some people it can be transformative. And one thing that's really surprising about something like intermittent fasting is that people with no energy, especially no energy because of the way they eat, you would think that fasting would make you have less energy when really it can feel like you've just been turbocharged and that your body is functioning like it's 10 years younger. So intermittent fasting is the #1 way to start getting into biohacking. We don't have to talk about healthy foods. We've done that in previous shows. That is just a basic of any kind of health. So let's think about that. Let's think about some kind of simple supplementation. There's so many supplements out there. If I was going to start with one thing that's biohacking related, I would look into gut health. If you're not taking probiotics and you're not thinking about eating fermented foods on a regular basis, then you're not nourishing your body the way that you should. And so all the other supplements probably are not being absorbed correctly if you don't have the right gut bacteria. So something to think about. Now, as we go further down the rabbit hole, we start to move into things called peptides. And there's one called sermorelin, which is the first of the peptides that most people start with. And that helps stimulate growth hormone and can bring your growth hormone levels back to where they were in your 20s. So if you've got a 50-year-old that's producing growth hormone like that, you start to see lean muscle mass, you start to see sleeping better, you start to see all the things, increased energy, all the things you could do in the past that you have stopped being able to do. And then at some point you also have to look into things that are really sci-fi almost, like Neuralinks, where they're putting these things in your brain and you can monitor on a regular basis how everything is flowing, and you might even be able to turn on areas of the brain that had previously been turned off. So we've just had the tip of the iceberg today on biohacking, but based on the comments and based on what people want, we can certainly go further down the rabbit hole on this. But every month we're going to have a Down the Rabbit Hole show, and again, this is the least of the Down the Rabbit Hole, I believe. But start looking into it, and if you haven't looked into biohacking, you've got a body that does not perform the way you want it to perform, then you need to start looking into it. Doesn't matter if you're 20, 30, 40, 50, wherever you are. Biohacking is something that you need to understand because this is the only body that you have. As Indiana Jones said, it's not the years, it's the mileage. So think about that. Can you find some way to decrease the mileage that you're putting on that car? We'll see you next time.